Professor Kazin, thank you so very much for joining our interview series.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. Let me start right away with the first question. In your article titled The Populist Persuasion, you discussed how populist rhetoric has evolved in the US. What role does populism play in bridging or deepening the divide between cultural and economic grievances today?
Well, actually, it's not an article, it's a book. Here's the latest edition. I've also written many articles on populism, of course. As you know, populism is both a language and some would argue a governing philosophy. I focus on it as a language in American history with ramifications for populism in other countries, of course. And historically, I think there's been a difference in the United States, which is really all I can talk about with any kind of authority, between populism of the left, which tends to focus on an economic elite, the 1% versus the 99%, the robber barons, the plutocrats, the monopolists, all kinds of words, of course, used to put down those with a lot of money and a lot of economic power. And left-wing populists try to unite the large majority, of course, regardless of gender, of race, of national background, national origin. Whereas right-wing populists in the United States, and this I think is true to a certain degree in Europe as well, look at the people, quote, quote, as a broad middle of the population, native born for the most part, who are, according to right-wing populists, being exploited, being oppressed by both a small elite at the top, which is economic and cultural, also an elite which is seen as being control of the state, whether it be the European community in Europe or the American federal government, and in league with a small but growing group of non-white, mostly immigrant people at the bottom. And historically, actually, it's been mostly non-whites who are either Latinos or Asian American or African Americans, but more recently it's been, of course, undocumented or illegal immigrants who've been the group at the bottom, which right-wing populists argue is being used by those at the top, the cultural and economic and political elite, to drive down wages, to destroy the cherished culture of the broad native-born middle class. So very, very generally, that's how right-wing, left-wing populists operate in the United States, and I think probably there's analogs to Europe as well. The way it's working now in American politics is left-wing populists, people like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, other progressives in and outside the Democratic Party are trying very hard to focus on this tradition of left-wing populism. But the problem is that Democrats and progressives generally also have a lot of cultural issues they care very much about, including much more lenient immigration laws and, if not open borders for some, and also transgender rights and rights for racial minorities. And so there's something of a clash there between the more narrow desire by economic left-wing populists to just focus on economics, focus on corporate money, focus on the very rich, seeing Donald Trump as one of those corporate rich, of course, and at the same time to help people who, since the 1960s especially, people on the left in this country have seen as oppressed and exploited, who have to be minorities in different ways, who have to be helped by the state and by social movements supporting them. Whereas on the right, as most of the people watching this know, because Donald Trump is hardly an unfamiliar figure in the world, there, I think, is a continuity of right-wing populism from the 19th century to the present in many ways, arguing that there's this, Hollywood elite, a woke elite in universities and other elite cultural institutions, which wants to foist its culture on the broad native-born majority, hardworking majority, and also which wants to give, supposedly, I think it's inaccurate, but nevertheless, the charge, of course, is powerful, give undocumented immigrants and immigrants generally jobs that native-born Americans should be having, and therefore, according to right-wing populists like Trump, drives down American wages, creates more crime in the cities than would happen otherwise, and so forth. So I think that's really how these two traditions of left-wing populism and right-wing populism are playing out today.
Right. How has populist rhetoric shaped the policy priorities of modern political parties in the US, particularly regarding economic inequality and social justice?
Well, social justice is a term which is hard to define. I mean, it's been used by the left and the right in American history. So I'll put that, aside for the moment. But in terms of economic inequality, this has been an issue in American politics throughout American history, but it's especially risen to the top in American politics as a major issue for really both right-wing and left-wing populists since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, since the well-publicized but not very large insurgency of Occupy Wall Street in 2011, 2012. Democrats, progressive Democrats especially, have tried to latch on to this issue, have argued that neoliberalism, which most people would argue has been a sort of a reigning order in American politics and economic thought since the 1970s, especially since Ronald Reagan's election in 1980, has made economic inequality worse, and have supported programs like those that Joe Biden has tried to push in the White House with, moderate success to try to help unions organize, to try to give child care benefits to all Americans with children, and other programs as well, to try to, in some ways, limit or narrow the economic inequality. On the other hand, conservative populists, not just like Donald Trump, but like J.D. Vance and others, argue that the main problem with economic inequality is corporations which are too woke, which favor those who have the right cultural politics over ordinary quote quote Americans. There has, however, been a move among some Republicans, very conservative Republicans, to embrace something of an anti-corporate politics. You can see this with Josh Hawley, who's a senator from Missouri, for example, who's embraced the Teamsters Union, one of the largest unions in America, and some other right-wing thinkers, especially right-wing Catholic thinkers, who hark back to a tradition in Catholic thought of social justice, a tradition which harks back to some of the encyclicals that the Catholic Church popes have put out, one called Rerum Novarum in 1891, another one called Quadragesimo Anno in 1831, which argued that unions were important institutions for ordinary people to better their lot, which argued that excessive rents, excessive interest rates are really punishing the poor and workers. And so there are some, not all, but mostly Catholic conservatives in the Republican Party especially, who have begun to talk a language of you might say, Catholic populism, which uses some of these tropes from encyclicals from the church to legitimate, arguments against corporate power. There's an interesting book called Tyranny Incorporated by a conservative writer, journalist. I'm blocking his name at the moment, but which argues that American corporations are engaged in tyrannical behavior against unions, people who try to organize unions, against people who are hurting from corporate behavior, charging excessive credit card interest, making it very difficult for people to use their healthcare insurance, denying them coverage, and this kind of thing. So there is, I think, a somewhat, I want to make sure I use that adjective, somewhat agreement between some right-wing populists and left-wing populists in the United States about cutting back on corporate power, about helping at least private sector unions to organize, because right now only 6% of American workers who work in the private sector are in unions, which is a very, very low percentage, one of the lowest in American history. But at the same time, there is still this disagreement among right and left-wing populists about culture, I think, and cultural arguments, as you know, are ones that last a long time. They're very difficult to compromise. You either believe abortion is a right that every woman should have, or you think it's killing babies. That's hard to compromise.
In one of your interviews, you argue that, and I quote, if the political and economic elites in our society and others around the world were more effective at living up to their ideals, populist talkers would likely be less popular. End of the quote. Well, what do you mean by ideals of political and economic elites?
Well, perhaps I should have said ideals of the nation, led by these elites, to be more accurate about it. Well, the United States especially, I think this is true in different ways in Europe too. You know, the stated ideals, equality, democracy, you know, government by the majority, a government which tries to promote the common welfare, which is a phrase in the preamble to the American Constitution and which is echoed in various documents, Declaration of Rights of Man and others in Europe. You know, if I would say, as a social democrat, if social democracy was practiced around the world, and people were guaranteed a decent life in their societies in perpetuity, then I think populism would be less popular. And that was certainly true in the United States. There were a lot of problems in the United States between the late 1940s into the mid 1960s. But this was in general a prosperous time, a time when unions were very powerful, a time when Social Security was extended to almost every American who had worked. And also beginnings of health insurance coverage for older people and also for poor people under Medicare and Medicaid. And populist rhetoric was not very powerful then. And populist movements, there were movements, of course, social movements, but they were not, I think, movements which argue that they were the voice of the great majority. There was the Black Freedom Movement, which of course was a movement for an oppressed minority who wanted to be part of American life for the most part. Though there's some radical groups in it who wanted to, you know, destroy American capitalism. So, you know, this is a time when I argue in my recent book, What It Took to Win, it's a history of the Democratic Party, that moral capitalism, a phrase I borrow from a friend of mine, also an historian, moral capitalism was the governing promise, I think, of the Democrats, who were the majority party in these years. And most Americans, working class Americans, as well as other Americans, believe things were getting better. And when people believe things are getting better, then populist leaders and populist movements have a harder time, I think, growing.
In one of your articles, you characterized Donald Trump's first administration as one of the most wretched president and administration in living memory. What factors have contributed to your defining Trump's administration as the most wretched?
Well, of course, wretched is a loaded emotional term. And here, of course, I'm talking about my own preferences. There's no sort of scholarly objectivity possible here. I can talk about why he won again, of course, last November. But first of all, I think as a leader, he is someone who is only interested in his own popularity, not very interested in policy. He wants to be the center of attention at all times. And he really is committed to no ideal, no policy that's not going to help him personally. So he's unwilling to take any risks, I think, and was unwilling to take any risks in terms of policy. I think that'll probably be true this year, in this second term as well, though we'll have to see. And of course, you know, everyone who's watching this knows about his personal life. being credibly accused of what would be considered rape in many nations, though he wasn't actually convicted of rape, but convicted of defaming someone who said that he had raped her. And various other statements he's made about immigrants, about shithole countries, and so forth. I mean, he's, I think, as an individual, a rather wretched person, someone I wouldn't want, to be friends with, or anybody I know to be friends with. But his administration, I should say, I probably should rechange that. It was more cautious, I think, than I expected it to be, in part because he was and is the leader of a party which still has a lot of people in it who are more cautious corporate executives. Elon Musk is an exception there, I think. And also, a lot of his appointees to his cabinet were more traditional Republicans. The Speaker of the House for a lot of his term was Paul Ryan, who's a very sort of Reaganite libertarian Republican who just really wants to cut the size of government and otherwise doesn't really care and is not a anti-immigrant crusader in any way. So in that sense, I think his administration could have been wretched, but it was less wretched than I expected it to be. And the major thing he was able to accomplish in his administration was a very conservative Republican ambition, which is to cut taxes, especially for richer Americans, even though all Americans got some kind of tax cut. So here he was the kind of thing that Ronald Reagan might have done as well. So in that sense, his administration had the potential to be wretched, but was less wretched than I expected it to be. Even though he made a lot of very foolish statements about immigration, he tried to build a wall, of course, all across the southern border, which spent a lot of money and also would have been rather easy to evade, and so. So he showed himself to be something of an ignoramus about policy, something that didn't really care very much about policy either. So in that sense, unlike other American presidents, he, as the head of the most powerful state in the world, he showed very little interest in actually what the state actually does that didn't benefit him personally. And so in that sense, I would say he's a wretched leader, was a wretched leader.
Right. You argue that, like most adherents of left egalitarian politics, I believe the only path to such a future, i.e. the more egalitarian and climate-friendly society, lies in adopting a populist program about jobs, income, healthcare, and other material necessities while making a transition to a sustainable economy. What exactly do you mean by populist program?
Well, by that I mean majoritarian. That is a program which does, in fact, benefit the majority of the people. Which is what I think when governments are popular, that's what they do. So sometimes popular and populist are friendly with one another. Sometimes they are very different. But in this sense, I think that, and as I said before, I mean, I think an honest social democracy would be the best way to do that, or what in America I would call moral capitalism. And so those programs include housing allowances, include universal health care, which is good health care, which is well administered by people who are, earn good incomes and don't have to work 12, 14 hours a day. It includes, I think, unions for the majority of people to protect themselves against abuse at work. And also, I think, has to include clearly a vigorous transition to a sustainable economy, or else the whole world is in trouble. Populist, you call them populist might, in a sense, betray my own definition of populism, which is based in American history, which is really as a discourse or a rhetoric. But I think I'm not one of those people who thinks populism bad, liberalism good. I think populism, I make this argument in my book, The Populist Persuasion. I think populism is a way that ordinary people and movements which support those people, or at least aim to represent those people, point out the differences between the stated ideals of society they live in and the actual performance of elites in that society, whether cultural elites, political elites, or economic elites. So in that sense, I think it can serve a very positive role. It sort of shows the danger signals. It shows why people are unhappy and but harks back to the ideals of that society. It doesn't argue as, say, socialists do, that one should have a very different kind of society, even though socialists can also be populists. It argues in terms of the ideals of that society, and often the ideals of people's religion as well, which is charity and comfort those who are afflicted, and so forth. So, I think there's an important role that populism can play in producing a decent society, as opposed to some people I know, like Jan Werner Muller and others who've written about populism, who argue that populism is always a ideology which fuels movements which produce authoritarian leaders. I think you can do that. Certainly, it has done that in Europe right now. Can point to several leaders like that, both those in office and those not in office, in their states. But I think it doesn't have to serve that role. I think there is a role for, I would argue, left-wing populism, an important one at that.
How do you explain Donald Trump's victory for a second term, given his open and aggressive endorsement of populist policies both in the US and globally? Additionally, how might his administration reshape the populist narrative domestically, particularly in aligning economic grievances with cultural conservatism?
Well, that's an important question, obviously, and one won't be able to answer really until he's several years into his term. The second part of that question. First part of the question, well, again, you probably read, and your people who are watching this have heard and read a lot of analyses of why Trump won. The most important reason he won, and this is usually why anybody unseats an incumbent party in this country, and probably other parties as well, is that most Americans thought the performance of the Biden administration, which is also the Biden-Harris administration, of course, was not good in terms of inflation, in terms of a more open immigration policy than most Americans would like. And also, I think, in terms of Biden himself is a very poor communicator. He used to be a mediocre communicator when he was younger, but in the last couple of years, he became really very bad at selling his own programs, some of which I think would have been quite popular if Americans had known about them, but they didn't. So an election which was actually rather close, if 232,000 voters in three key states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania had voted differently, somewhat more in Pennsylvania than the other two states. If they had voted for Harris instead of Trump, then Harris would have been elected, even though she would have won fewer popular votes than Trump. And as I'm sure everyone watching this knows, we don't have popular elections in this country. We have state-by-state elections which elect the president. So, and Trump also is a charismatic figure. He's a figure with a large, though not a majority of Americans on his side, but perhaps 30% of Americans really like him very much. He has a movement, the MAGA movement, which Democrats don't have anything like that. So even though Democrats have more people on the ground getting people out to vote, Trump has more solid support, and therefore he won somewhat more votes than he had in 2016, about 2 million more popular votes. But Harris won 10 or 11 million fewer votes than Biden had in 2016. So Trump won in large part because a lot of Democrats decided not to vote because they were unenchanted enough with the Biden-Harris administration, its performance, but not happy enough about Trump to actually come out and vote. And what will Trump do in terms of let me remind myself of the second part of your question here.
How might his administration reshape the populist narrative domestically?
Yeah. Well, again, it depends how well he does, right? This is a question of contingency. It's a question of how he performs as president in the second term. Certainly, he will try because he is a much better politician than he is a policymaker. He will certainly try to keep both the more traditional Republicans, the more corporate Republicans who don't want who want lower taxes, who want less regulation, who want a smaller government in general. He'll try to keep them on his side. At the same time as he will also try to keep the cultural populists on his side, those who don't want, who want to cut back immigration as much as possible, who want to, legal and illegal, I should say, and also who want to do away with transgender rights and some aspects of gay and lesbian rights as well. So he's going to try to keep sort of the cultural side of his coalition on board, as well as the economic side. And he will try, I think, as Democrats try, to beef up manufacturing in the United States, to have more things made in the United States. That won't be easy given the supply side, given the fact that goods that are manufactured, the final manufacturing in the United States uses parts from all over the world. It'll be very hard to cut that back and make a lot of those parts that are now made much more cheaply in other parts of the world, make those parts in the United States. But he'll at least rhetorically talk about that. And a lot will depend, as always, on the state of the economy. A lot will depend, as always, on whether there's scandals during his administration. And a lot will depend, too, on who wins the midterm election. As many of you know, everybody in the House of Representatives is up for election every 2 years. And in 2026, Democrats have a very good chance to take back the House of Representatives. In that case, anything Trump will be able to accomplish will have to be accomplished by executive action, which are actions he can take, but some of them will be popular, some of them won't be popular. But and also, the 2028 election campaign will begin even before the 2026 midterm results are known, but it'll certainly begin as soon as they are known. So he will, the last 2 years of a president's last term, and this will be his last term, are really very much overshadowed by the presidential race to come. So in that case, he might only have 2 years to accomplish whatever he's going to accomplish. And that includes trying to make populists on both sides happy.
How concerned are you about the second Trump administration in terms of the resilience of American democratic institutions? There are those pundits who argue that American democracy will not survive another Trump term.
Well, here I part with some other people on the left. I don't think that American democratic institutions are in serious trouble. I think they will be shaken and are being shaken by Trump being reelected and then coming to power next month. But I think that, first of all, the Congress is still pretty closely divided between the two parties, even though Republicans are in charge. Many states, big states like New York and California, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Illinois are run by Democratic governors, and most of the states have majorities in the legislatures as well, and they can act, they can bring cases into court against some of the things that Trump wants to do. So civil society, also civil society in the United States is still fairly strong. There are very important non-governmental institutions like the American Civil Liberties Union, which will bring suit against some of the things that Trump will want to do about immigrants, especially if he tries to do something about children born here of immigrant parents and tries to deport them along with their parents, which is will be deporting American citizens because anybody born here is an American citizen. Also, even though the grassroots left is somewhat dormant now and has been a little sort of exhausted since the election, there still are important groups on the left, including some important unions like the American Federation of Teachers, the United Auto Workers, which are all very supportive of Kamala Harris, and they will also be able to mobilize people against the Trump administration. So, again, the question is how popular Trump is. If he remains popular enough, he'll be able to do some of the things he wants to do. But there's still a court system, which the Supreme Court, as most people know, is controlled by appointees of Republicans, 3 of whom were appointed by Donald Trump in his first term. But there are other courts as well. And some of those courts actually are controlled more by progressives or liberal justices, judges, I should say. They're not called justices on the lower courts. And so I think we can look for chaos and turmoil. It doesn't mean democratic institutions are in trouble. Now, one thing I should say, which is a problem, is that Trump is showing every sign of wanting to sue people in the media he disagrees with. He already sued ABC News over a comment that one of their anchors, George Stephanopoulos, made, and ABC News settled with him for several $1 million. And he would like to bring suits against other media institutions as well, especially the so-called legacy institutions, which most young people and many non-voters don't follow at all, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major networks. And so in that sense, he will perhaps have more success, at least cowing them, at least intimidating some of these institutions. But he won't be able to do away with the internet. He won't be able to stop people from demonstrating. The military was a break on him to extent in his first term. I think will be again. He won't be able to call out the military to put down peaceful demonstrations, which he talked about doing that in 2020, last year of his first term. So I should say that I hate to be, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And also, again, as I mentioned before, he only has 4 years and probably only has 2 years as a really effective policymaker. So I'm not as afraid as some people I know are.
And lastly, Professor Kazin, right-wing populism continues to rise across Europe despite the liberal European Union's success story. How do you think populist parties and movements will be influenced globally after Trump begins his second term? Could his presidency embolden far-right leaders abroad and foster new alliances among far-right populist movements?
Well, it's certainly a possibility. As you know, he's been very good friends with Orban. Orban is invited to national conservative conferences, and there was one in Budapest, which I think the first time an American conservative organization has had its conference overseas. And clearly, the right-wing populist leaders of parties like the RN in France, very happy, I think, with his election, and that's probably true of right-wing populist parties and movements across the continent. Same time, if you talk about America first and you are suspicious of European institutions, whether EU or NATO or other institutions, then I think have a very hard time really putting together any kind of sort of operationally powerful alliance between Trump and his counterparts in Europe. And but I think structurally, historically, I should say, I think we're in a sort of interregnum, if you will, between what my friend Gary Gerstl, in a very good book recently, calls the neoliberal order, which is ending in many ways and has ended in some places, I think, and something else and something new. And as the great Marxist theorist and Italian communist Antonio Gramsci said, in this interregnums, many morbid symptoms appear. And so right-wing populism, from my point of view, is a morbid symptom. But I think as things change, as I think there is a greater demand for the state to actually supply decent living for a majority of its citizens and actually do that, then I think there might be a revival of whether you call it social democracy or not, at least of populists talking on the left and of people who are demanding that the government do what it says it will do, which is to provide a decent living for a majority of its citizens, with the help, of course, of private capital. So I think again, I am heartened by the fact that Trump has only 4 years. He can't get more than that without changing the Constitution, which is very difficult to do in this country, much more difficult than it is in many countries to change the Constitution. And so I think he'd have a hard time. I think most Americans who support Trump don't like the idea of alliances between the United States and other countries. They want the United States to be independent of those alliances, whatever those alliances are, especially if they cost money. So we'll have to see about that.
Professor Kazin, thank you so very much. I appreciate your time.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.